Today's lecture is in, as I said, scholasticism or the medieval synthesis. Anyone here? Okay. And I'm just going to start very briefly with this painting backdrop. This isn't a painting of the epoch being discussed. We talk about the medieval or the Middle Ages. Obviously, we don't mean the 19th century. But I think this painting from the 19th century by Ludwig Seitz does a very good job of capturing the essence of the discussion when we're talking about medieval synthesis or the scholastic tradition. And the title says it all. The title of the painting is Faith and Reason United, right? And that's the depiction here. On your right-hand side of the world, you have a representation of reason. On the left-hand side here, you have a representation of faith, clearly having a very cordial and civil dialogue and discussion. And this was meant to be the kind of the capture of the spirit of the age, particularly as represented by one of the authors you're going to be reading over this unit, St. Thomas Aquinas. In fact, the backdrop behind reason on the right hand and faith on the left hand, in both is actually the grayscale figure in the background. On both sides is actually Thomas Aquinas teaching young children or kids or students. So again, you see that the capture here both of Thomas Aquinas behind on that side of faith and this side of reason, again, is a kind of a very nice painting capturing the idea of the synthesis, right? As I hope you'll encounter in your readings. The inscription up there is also a very interesting inscription. It's from Pope Leo XIII encyclical of the time, and it reads, "The splendor of the divine truths received into the mind helps the understanding," right? So again, this is a papal decree, if you wish, included in one of his encyclicals, Pope Leo XIII, which clearly states that the greatness or the splendor of divine truth received in the mind, so again, this combination, the synthesis between reason and faith, helps the understanding, right? So this is the running theme, if you wish, of today's lecture and of the three authors you're going to be reading. I have to begin with an important note. Of the three authors you're going to be encountering, only one really qualifies as a scholastic author, St. Thomas Aquinas, right? But speaking of scholastic tradition, or what I prefer to call the medieval synthesis, one begins, of course, by the readings by speaking about Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, and Thomas Aquinas. But it wouldn't be accurate to speak of Ibn Rushd and Maimonides as scholastic thinkers, as I hope you'll see why in the course of the lecture itself, right? But they nonetheless prelude and prepare in many ways for what we then call the scholastic tradition. So the term itself, to say a few words, simply means studious or learned from the Greek. And essentially it means a school person, a schoolmaster, a school person, right? And it became associated with the teachers of the schools in Europe, particularly, i.e. the universities, okay? And that's why I'm saying with Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, it's not accurate to say they're scholastic, but certainly Thomas Aquinas, okay? The term itself being specifically kind of formulated to speak about the school teachers of the medieval era. But nonetheless, you'll see the role of, or you see the running theme of the medieval synthesis of faith and reason as captured by Ludwig Seitz in that painting, already encountered very clearly in the work of Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, and perhaps you would say, perhaps even as early as Augustine to some extent, and others. As far as the term scholasticism or scholastic tradition, it usually doesn't ring positive. It's received quite a bit of negative critique as you go forward in history, particularly by subsequent ages, as of the Renaissance and all the way down, perhaps to even our times. So, and I'll start just by these two quick references on how scholasticism has been referenced and evaluated. This is from Laurentius Valla in the 15th century. He's an Italian humanist. And of scholasticism, on the scholastics, he says, they are a superstitious and senseless race of professors who make their pupils swear never to contradict Aristotle. Aristotle, of course, factors big into the picture. So not exactly a positive refrain, if you wish. And it gets echoed still in the 19th century with Hippolyte Taine, again speaking about the medieval era, the scholastic era, and he says these are 3 centuries at the bottom of that gloomy abyss, did not add a single idea to man's intellectual inheritance. This is generally the fortunate, I don't know, unfortunate, kind of evaluative comments one encounters when talking about the medieval era, al-Qurun al-Wusta, right? Another term for them is the Dark Ages. And so with this in mind, one says, all right, then why are we reading this? If they've added absolutely nothing to our inheritance, and if they are senseless and irrational professors, what's there to be had here? Well, of course, one hopes throughout the lecture today, and as you encounter the texts yourselves, and in class discussion, that you'll see there's a bit more to them than senseless superstition and abysses encountered in those centuries. There's much going on in this medieval era, in the scholastic tradition that goes, of course, beyond, I swear never to contradict Aristotle. I hope at least you will get a sense of that. So, to begin with, I want to throw the ball in your court for a while and ask you, with the clickers you have, to help me launch today's lecture with the following imagine exercise, right? So I ask this of you. Imagine that you were a person of monotheistic faith, of some authority, and one with broad scholarly interests, and imagine that you were informed of the recent discovery of a corpus, i.e. a large body of works of times past, and the suspicion is that this corpus, this body of works, holds much of the wisdom of the past, right? And you're given these 4 possible options what you could do with that. What would you do? Would you procure the corpus and make sure that no word of such discovery goes out until you can figure out what to do with it? Would you make sure that no word of such discovery ever goes out and you destroy the writings? Or would you bring together a group of scholars to study and translate the corpus? Or would you procure the corpus and sell it to the highest bidder? Please use your clickers. You don't have clickers. The 3 of you. Not a single clicker to share. That's just wrong. I'm sorry, we're out of clickers. Who has clickers to spare? I'm sorry. I apologize, as I said in the beginning, we don't have enough clickers to go around. I apologize, but you know. Can you vote using the same device more than once? I don't think so. Right. But we have 50 clickers around the room, and I only see 39 responses, 40 responses, 42. So a bit more. Right. You keep clicking? Right. You're just adding? No, I don't think you can. Right. 44. All right, so as not to waste too much time, I'm going to stop at 45 responses. There we go. We're good? Okay, so this is good. 16% are cautious, thinking, wait a minute, let's see what's in this corpus before we decide. 2% are overly cautious, just burn it, just pretend no one found it. 80% would bring together a group of scholars, very AUB of you, to translate and study the corpus. And 2%, wild guess, business students, would sell, no, of course not. It could be economics, right? Sell to the highest bidder. I'm sorry, I shouldn't make these jokes, but I do. I can't help it. All right, so let's democracy works, right? So let's go with those who voted C. So let us actually get a group of scholars together, study, translate the corpus. However, the more you translate and the more you study this corpus, it becomes kind of clear that the content of the works stands in many respects against the generally accepted beliefs and traditions and worldview, and that it may indeed, on some level, threaten the widely accepted worldview. Now what do? Do you make a public announcement of the discovery, urging all people to examine and re-examine their accepted worldview? Do you burn all the manuscripts and brand anyone who would mention them and their content as a criminal of sorts, a heretic? Do you continue studying further and seek out from them what may indeed be of much use? Or do you cover up the fact that they were being translated, pretend they just got discovered, and sell to the highest bidder? Look what we just found. Right? So the idea is that there's a sense that as we translate these works, they may really challenge our accepted worldview, or at least not sit too comfortably with our accepted worldview. So I'm hoping we get the same number of responses so we can get a comparative, how many people changed their mind or didn't. All right, so 37, 38. Chance to sip my coffee. 40, 41, 42. Almost there. Okay. All right, 45, that's good, yeah? Oh, 46, okay, we're cheating. Goody. Slight change, slight drop from 80, right? So 8% went different places. So 7% now would actually urge people to re-examine their beliefs. Right? This is even stronger than the 80% that we're studying and the 72% that we're continue. Very AUB liberal arts of you. Burn all the manuscripts. Apparently they've increased. We have more people. There was 2%, yeah, in the previous one would burn the manuscripts. Now we have 11%. Continue studying further. Still wins the day, and cover up the fact. And we have more people, I think, transferring their majors, selling to the highest bidder, right? Thank you really for helping me launch this picture of what we would do in that case. And this is 21st century responses. Because very interestingly, this was actually the situation, not exactly, they didn't have clickers, but kind of similar situation in 11th century Spain, right? So what happens in 11th century Spain, in Toledo in particular, and as part of the reconquest of Islamic Spain by the Western Spanish, if you wish to call them, forces, particularly with Alfonso the Great in 1085, the fall of Toledo. What happens in that event is exactly the discovery of this amazing library in Toledo with an amazing corpus of works written by commentators such as Ibn Rushd, you're going to be reading, and others, but also actually translation of original works, translations of works of Aristotle, translations of works of other philosophers of the Greco-Roman era, particularly the Greek era. And it's a very significant discovery because such works had been thought to have been lost, right? So it's almost a rediscovery, right? Of course, not lost as in no one knew they existed. No, they were known, they were familiar, but the works were kind of lost, particularly those of Aristotle. And so there's a phenomenal rediscovery here. And in fact, what they do is what the majority of you decided to do. They get a group of scholars, translators, sit down and study and further study and continue to study, even if and at what point it becomes a bit uncomfortable what's being read and translated. Because as you'll see, this is why we call it the medieval synthesis. There has to be a synthesis of sorts between the proclamations of revelation and faith and some proclamations of reason, right? Or some discoveries, if you wish to call them, of reason. But yes, the scholars continue their translation and their study. And in fact, it picks up, right? This is courtesy of Google Maps. It picks up from Toledo all the way to Provence in France and all the way down to Palermo in modern day, well, even then, Sicily, right? And in general, it kind of, you find it pick up and it becomes kind of propagated as a project of translation and studies, particularly in areas where there's a commingling and a coexistence of the three main monotheistic faiths, the Judaic, the Christian, and Islamic. And so it doesn't die out when they figure out this is going to be quite a project. On the contrary, it actually picks up quite a bit, the increased interest in the study of these ancient texts and spreads really around that kind of area and then onwards to Constantinople and other places. In some sense, one could say the culmination was actually in Sicily, under the rule of Roger of Sicily, because he was a great patron of these studies and a great supporter of these translations. And it is reputed that William of Moerbeke was perhaps the first to complete the translation of the Aristotelian corpus, particularly the metaphysics and the logic and these great texts by Aristotle. And he's an interesting character also because there's some hints, perhaps more than hints, but no certainties, that he may actually have been friends or at least acquaintances with St. Thomas Aquinas, who you're going to be reading. And so maybe some influence from his works onto the works of Thomas Aquinas. Again, there's no certainty in these things. So just before we move on, just again a quick question. So as we said, what you had as the 21st century students decided let's study, let's translate, happened in Toledo. in the 11th century, 12th century. And who do you think was the main driving force behind that decision in Toledo? Was it perhaps the common people of Toledo who said, yeah, sure, come on, let's translate and study? Or was it the political powers of Toledo? Was it the Archbishop of Toledo? Or was it the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo? Who do you think was the main driving force behind this kind of translation movement, what we call the Toledo event, actually? Very important. We're at 35, 36. Take a wild guess. Okay, a couple more before we move on. 42, 43, 44, 45. 5. Okay, there we go. That's good. Okay. Good. So 4% think of it was the common people of Toledo. Yeah, no. Not back then, not today. Yeah. In some cases. The political powers of Toledo makes rational sense, right? I mean, you know, the Archbishop of Toledo, 13%. And the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo would kind of make sense as a choice because scholasticism, no, though, I'm sorry, that was a strict option. They come later. Believe it or not, it was the Archbishop of Toledo, right? And I want to emphasize this point. I really want to emphasize it. Yes, it was the religious figure of Toledo who was the main person behind kind of pushing and constantly urging the study and translation. Because you have to keep something in mind, and I want to put this out there just really to challenge the normal cliche of, you know, religion versus philosophy or science, okay? When we say schoolmen and we say schools, all the schools were religious institutes, including how AUB started, by the way, yeah? So this, please do challenge that cliche we have where we pit philosophy and science on the one hand versus religion on the other hand. Not at all a general rule. Yes, it could be the case, sure, but that's not the general rule, and it wasn't the rule nor the modus operandi of the scholastics. And in fact, I gave you a hint in an earlier slide today. The cathedral in Toledo is where the translators were housed in the 12th century. This was very much a project within the institute, not against the institute, not outside the institute. I mean the institute of the church. And again, as I said, the schools were, after all, religious institutes, right? And of course, this is understandable on two levels. On the one hand, the common people, of course, were kept out of this discussion. And this was kind of a gentleman's agreement, and in a lot of places, actually, it was an explicit written agreement that what goes on in the cathedrals and the translation houses stays in the translation houses, right? Certain things we can discuss on premises, certain things we can discuss in these circles, but they don't leave the confines of that discussion. And this connects to some of the things one encounters also with Ibn Rushd, perhaps to some extent with earlier authors you've encountered, this notion of the many and the few, okay? And Ibn Rushd will explicitly address this notion of who has access to these discussions and who gets to engage in these discussions. So there's no controversy when you have the scholars, the school persons, the schoolmen, whatever you want to call them, engage in this discussion. Of course, at certain points it does develop into controversies later on, some centuries later. But in general, it was from the institute almost, you know, under the patronage of the institute. It would be, of course, wrong to say that it all starts with the Toledo event. And so just very, very briefly, I'm going to do a kind of going back in time very briefly, not much details, just to introduce you to some other figures who kept the ball running and going. Because, as I said, it was a rediscovery, but it wasn't kind of totally gone and forgotten and dead, particularly in this tradition. And so you can go back as far as the 5th century, or 6th century, the 500s, with Boethius, who's considered one of the great figures early on in this discussion between faith and reason, with his work on kind of a conversation with philosophy, right? The consolation of philosophy. Then you move forward to the 9th century with John Scotus Regina, whose name basically means, well, John the Irish, if you wish. Scotus doesn't mean Scottish here. And there's something interesting and significant about John Scotus, is being Irish. Towards that part of the world, Greek was still very much a language of education. It hadn't been totally replaced by Latin. like in other parts of the of what we call, you know, the West or Christendom or whatever you want to call it. And so again, his access to Greek helped also give him access to the study and translation of this rediscovered corpus. And this is one of his quotes there, which I think is very telling, again, in this context of synthesis. He says, "Christ wears two shoes in the world, Scripture and nature. Both are necessary to understand the Lord, and at no stage can creation be seen as a separation of things from God." Right? So again, very much this notion of synthesis. Nature here really is part of the natural philosophy, or the worldview of natural philosophy. Of course, moving forward, we get to perhaps one of the greatest figures, perhaps the beginnings of scholasticism proper for some people, with St. Anselm and his great work on well, he's mostly known for, you know, the initial proofs for God's existence using reason or philosophy or etc. But certainly a figure in this kind of continuum. And this is just looking at what we call the Western tradition with the Eastern tradition or the Arab Islamic tradition. There's many names one needs to mention as well, with, you know, at the time of, well, pre-Al-Ghazali, but certainly around the time of Ikhwan al-Safa, who you've already met, who are kind of also doing a synthesis. The Neoplatonic elements are clear, I think. Usage of terms like, you know, forms and you know, the Platonic forms and other things encountered in that epistle. Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, one can name many. And one of my favorites is Abelard, simply because he's such a brilliant person who lives this kind of synthesis to the point that he calls his son Astrolabe. I don't know. Do you know what an astrolabe is? Any of you? It's kind of, yeah, they study the stars. Yeah, he was so, you know, central on the importance of science. You know, Haram, his son, but you know, there you go. Okay, so obviously the basic point I'm trying to make is no event comes out of a vacuum, right? Neither does the great Socrates come out of a vacuum. He was a student of another philosopher, nor does Augustine come out of a vacuum, and certainly the Toledo event doesn't come out of a vacuum, right? But it's significant in its, I think it's a scope and its, really its size, right? I mean, the discovery was immense, and the movement in translation and study was immense. And yes, it develops into what we then call the scholastic tradition, or it brings forth the scholastic tradition. So before we move on to the next section, a quick recap question. So if you remember, we started today's lecture with a little painting, 19th century, by Ludwig Seitz. And just a quick question, who is sitting in the backdrop on both sides of the painting, behind reason and faith? Was it Pope Leo XIII, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine of Hippo, or Averroes? Hint, it wasn't me, obviously. So just a quick recap question, we're all on the same page. If you get this wrong, I can't move on. It's that simple. No, don't get it wrong on purpose. We'll move on. 30 seconds. Let me check the time. All right, we're good. Okay. We have an additional welcome, number 47, 48. Good. All right. So the majority, their majority, got it right. Of course, it was Thomas Aquinas. Augustine of Hippo, yes, he's a lovely character, but he wasn't in that picture. Averroes, not in that picture. And certainly not Pope Leo XIII, but you're right that there was an inscription by Pope Leo XIII. So you're not totally off. But you're somewhat off with Augustine, well, quite off with Augustine and Ibn Rushd. With that, let us move now to the actual authors themselves and what we're calling the synthesizers, right? So we've given this background of, as we said, the translation and the study and bringing together the philosophical tradition rediscovered or discovered along with the monotheistic tradition. And particularly, by the way, it's Aristotle. And that's why, as you saw with Laurentius Valla, he says, you know, they swear not to contradict Aristotle, right? Aristotle was the main figure there. And in the libraries in Toledo, most of the works translated and the commentaries on works were mostly on the works of Aristotle. So you'll see he factors quite a bit into your readings. So much so, in fact, that with Thomas Aquinas, he gets to a point where if he's talking about Aristotle, he doesn't actually need to tell you. He says, the philosopher. Who else? Right? And so whenever you see in Thomas Aquinas' work, he's referring to the philosopher, that's Aristotle. If he's referring to the commentator, That's our friend over here, Ibn Rushd, the commentator. Right? Maimonides has a nickname, but he doesn't factor. We have Ibn Rushd, who in this unit represents, if you wish, the synthesis or this attempt at the bringing together of philosophy and revelation from the Islamic tradition. Musa ibn Maymun, or Maimonides. The Idis always means Ibn, so just, you know, if you want to go back and watch the great documentary 300, Leonidas is the son of the Leon, right? So this is Musa ibn Maymun from the Judaic tradition, and of course Thomas Aquinas from the Christian tradition. And you'll see commonalities, of course, though you may also see certain differences. And so we'll start with Ibn Rushd, chronologically kind of there, although Maimonides and Ibn Rushd were kind of contemporaries at one point. And very, very quick bio sketch, right? All this information now is readily available, you know, through online sources, so I just give it as a quick backdrop. So we're talking about Spain, obviously. We're talking about the 12th century with Ibn Rushd. And we're talking about a great figure in the history of Eastern, Western, I don't like these divides, just the history of philosophy. And he's a very interesting character because he was a physician, a doctor, i.e. He was certainly a philosopher, and he was also a qadi. And qadi here in the full religious sense of the term, right? In fact, at one point he was qadi qudat, right? And he comes from a family in that tradition, you know, in Spain, in Andalus. And he is very much an interesting figure in his own person, because being both a qadi, a jurist, and a philosopher and a physician, his own being kind of represents this kind of synthesis between, you know, philosophy, religious sciences, and the sciences. He was really kind of recruited, if you wish to say, a bit like, you know, how football teams these days, they send scouts and recruit people at a young age. A lot of the rulers of the time tried to do that to bring in great minds into their courts. And Ibn Tufayl was one of those recruiters, if you wish, at the time. And so he kind of recruits Ibn Rushd as one of the great minds, and I don't think he was disappointed by it. And it's very interesting, just a quick anecdote. Ibn Tufayl actually was meant to write the commentaries on Aristotle, but he was busy on another project. He had dedicated himself to, well, his greatest project, in fact, the only project that survives from him. His great work, Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, if you're familiar with that, a great work. So Ibn Tufayl was dedicated to writing that work when the Caliph had asked him, of the area had asked him to, if he could clarify and comment on certain of Aristotle's works. He says, I'm kind of busy, but I have a friend who could. So he calls in Ibn Rushd to do so. As I said, prominent. He was very well known, very, very much a polymath in many ways. He's written on astronomy and on medicine, but mostly he's known for his works on philosophy, and particularly the commentaries on Aristotle. At a certain point in his life, he falls out of grace with the political powers of the time, and he's exiled and dies in exile in Marrakesh. 3 months after he dies, by the way, they try to bring his body in, well, they do actually, they bury it, but he was dead, so the honors after death. So I'm not going to go over the entire text, obviously, with you. That's what you will do in your class discussions. But I will give you a few illustrations from Ibn Rushd, then Maimonides, then Thomas Aquinas, on this backdrop we presented as the medieval synthesis, as the bringing together of philosophy and faith, or revelation, or whatever you want to call it. And so the title of the text you're reading is on the harmony of religion and philosophy, but actually the accurate translation, of course, is the decisive treatise determining the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion. Right? كتاب فصل المقال وتقرير ما بين الحكمة والشريعة من اتصال. Note the Arabic, it uses حكمة and sharia. It doesn't use the word فلسفة, right? Because the word فلسفة is not Arabic. It has a different connotation. So this is the purpose of the work, to decide the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion, okay? And so he begins with, he sets down already in the first page the project and what he wants to do, and how you'll see how he will move on to do it. And the hypothetical if here I was very happily given a note by one of our colleagues last time, is actually not that hypothetical, but more of a given, right? The if as in, if one assumes, if one accepts, kind of given. So if the activity of philosophy, right? So sorry, just make sure we're moving in the right track. So the question is, and he's writing, it's very important because he's writing this not only as from his perspective as a philosopher, but as a qadi. Right? Remember, as I said, he's very much in jurisprudence. So he says, the real question here we want to establish is what is the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion? And that could be brought down to a simple question. What is the attitude? What is the position of law? And law here doesn't mean civic law, it means religious law. Right? What is the position of the law as regards philosophy? Does it allow it? Does it forbid it? What is it? Right? And so it's a very important question to begin with. And he says, if the activity of philosophy is nothing more than the study of existing beings and reflection upon them as indications of the artisan, and if the law has encouraged and urged reflection on beings, then it is clear that this name, philosophy, what this name signifies is either obligatory or recommended by law. Right? So if I can show that that's what philosophy does, and if I can show that the law either encourages or urges or commands that we do that, then it's obvious that religious law commands this, or at least recommends it. Right? So we'll start with the second hypothetical if or given. Does the law actually, religious law i.e., does the law encourage the study of beings and reflection upon them? And as far as the qadi is concerned, it most certainly does. Right? And his references are direct Quranic verses, which he gives, and we'll give the two main ones he uses here. He says, God himself says, reflect, you have vision. And this is fa'al amr. This is an imperative. Right? Reflect. This, he says, is textual evidence urging us, commanding us to reflect. Other textual evidence, have they not studied the kingdom of the heavens and the earth and whatever things God has created? This is perhaps not the same imperative kind of note of the first, but it certainly encourages, according to Ibn Rushd. However, if the same thing, X, is both commanded and encouraged, then it's obviously commanded, according to Ibn Rushd. And so does the law urge us, command us to study and reflect upon beings? It most certainly does so. Right? So that's set down. But how do we move there from that to philosophy? So that the law commands us to reflect upon beings, and then somehow we want to go from that to say, well, we should study philosophy. And he says, well, what is reflection? Reflection is nothing more than inference and drawing out the unknown from the known. And since this is reasoning, or at any rate done by reasoning, therefore, and therefore is a logical conclusion, we are under an obligation to carry out our study of beings by intellectual reasoning. Right? So reflect, you have vision, we have to reflect. How do you do that? Well, this is what reflection is. It needs to use reason. It must use intellectual reasoning. Okay? And if it must use intellectual reasoning, then we have to go and study the forms of reasoning, the different forms of reasoning, the methods of reasoning. And for Ibn Rushd, well, where do you find that? You find that in the works of those who have done studies in the field, i.e. the works of philosophy, right? So in a nutshell, his approach to the synthesis to say that what the religious law requires us to do is actually best addressed through philosophical study is done in this manner, right? So the law obliges us to study beings and reflect upon them. Reflection is only possible through intellectual reasoning, the highest of which demonstrative, right? Qiyas al-aqli in Arabic, right? But if I want to do demonstrative reasoning, I must learn the principles of demonstrative reasoning, the proper methods of reasoning, valid argumentation, invalid argumentation. How do I work from premises to conclusion, etc. And that is certainly done before us by greats like Aristotle in setting down the rules of logic and posterior analytics or whatever. And then you gain that skill, and then you go back to number one, reflect upon being using those tools of reasoning. But then he adds a very interesting note. He says, however, in any field, not only philosophy, no one starts from scratch, right? If I want to do studies in mathematics, I look at what my predecessors did in that field, and I start from where they left off, right? If I want to do natural science, and this is true of any field, and that's equally true and perhaps even more true of philosophy. If work has already been done in this field, then let's build on it. The fact that they're not monotheists, says Ibn Rushd, the fact that they're not of our faith really shouldn't make a difference. Again, it's more than it shouldn't make a difference. The argument is, of course, much more articulated in the text you're reading, but I don't want to spoil everything and leave it much more to your class discussion. But the conclusion he certainly reaches is that the law, i.e. religious law, obliges, مش allows, مش recommends, obliges us to the study of philosophy. مأمور به على جهة الوجوب, he says. Right. With that, we move on to our next author, Moses Maimonides. And here we'll look at a different illustration of the synthesis of reason and philosophy. You might be forgiven, or not forgiven, of course, but it's very understandable if, as you start reading Moses Maimonides' selection from his Guide to the Perplexed, you think this isn't synthesis, this is philosophy. And this is probably true in the early sections, from which we'll illustrate very briefly. But keep going, and it's definitely synthesis. Because essentially what he's presenting here and what he's raising as questions of philosophy and how does one address them in philosophy are raised as a means to an end, not an end in themselves. The question is very much echoing what you've encountered on Augustine. What then do I love when I love God? What then is the God I worship? Right? A question of whatness, a question of the essence of the divine. And what Maimonides wants to say here is, can we actually answer that question? Can we actually define or come to an understanding of the essence of God? Can we actually define the divine? Right? And given his answer, which I'll spoil it for you, is no, then he moves on and say, all right, what about all these references in Scripture that speak about God and the attributes of God and etc.? Right? So he moves from the use of the tools of philosophy to then speak about reading Scripture and what to look for in Scripture and how does one attain closeness to God and etc. So the question, as we said, is of definition. Very briefly, again, just as background, really you can look into it. He's very much, again, a great scholar in the Judaic tradition. He was a rabbi, and he was very interesting, a bit like Ibn Rushd. He was also a physician. In fact, he was a physician to none other than Salah ad-Din at one point. So again, very much immersed in the practical sciences and natural philosophies, as well as religious studies of his own monotheistic tradition. And it's very interesting to see that, and again, in their persons, they have the synthesis, right? So, he begins with a central premise in trying to look at the possibilities of knowing the essence of God or defining the essence of God. And the central premise is this, that within a monotheistic context, speaking of God can only be in terms of speaking of simple unity, right? That he is one simple substance without any composition or plurality of elements. This is a central monotheistic premise. Okay? Just to be clear, what we mean here by simple unity is that basically God is not made of parts. He is one in the only sense that anything can be one. So much so that, you know, with other thinkers like, for instance, Al-Kindi, he says only God is truly one. Right? All other things are not really one. So only God can be thought of and must be thought of in terms of simple unity. Right? Simple, i.e. not made up of compounds. Okay? So given this premise, which he believes is an essential premise for monotheism, we then move on to say, well, can we know the essence of God? Can we define the essence of God? All right? And he says, we want to approach this from what we mean by definition from a philosophic perspective. What do we mean when we say, I want to define something? Right? And he says there are five really, but the four main ones we're going to focus on, and there's a fifth way to speak about anything. Every description, he says, of any object by an affirmative attribute, which includes the assertion that an object is of a certain kind, must be made in one of the five following ways. So the first way of speaking about anything is description by definition, which is essential. In other words, to speak about the essence of something, jawhar, right? I.e. explanation of a name containing the true essence of the object. Okay? And can we speak of God in that way? Can we describe God? Can any of us know the true essence of God? I don't think so. Right? Yeah, I mean, he doesn't think so either. As Ibn Tufayl says in his work, which unfortunately we don't read, but it's just, I think, important reference, is he says, the knowledge of his essence is his essence, and his essence is the knowledge of his essence, right? To know God is to be God, essentially. Being kind of the simple unity. He says, all agree that this kind of description cannot be given of God, for there is no previous causes to his existence by which he could be defined, right? God is first. And so if you want to define anything, you have to make reference to things outside of itself. That cannot be the case with God. Only God is essentially God. Yeah. Even, by the way, for Moses Maimonides, as you'll see soon, even if I say God exists, it's problematic. I don't mean he doesn't exist. I mean, what do I really mean when I say that? Okay? So hold on to that. We'll get to it in the third way. A second way of definition is by part of the description. So we say, for instance, that the man or the human is a rational animal or a social animal or a laughing animal, right? So we use a part of the essence. So we're partly rational. And so I say, well, I can reference part of my definition to describe of the human. Is this something we can use in speaking about God? Perhaps, you know, God is Rahman, God is Rahim, God is the Father, God is this description of God? No, says Maimonides. And why not? So this is a description by part of its definition, but what was our premise? Simple unity, simple substance. There's no partitioning when it comes to God. Right? You cannot, in monotheistic context, God is not made of parts that you can, you know, talk of separately. Right? So any approach to the definition that must speak in terms of parts of the essence obviously doesn't apply. Right? For if we were to speak of a portion of his essence, we should consider his essence to be compound, but we had already established that God's essence is not compound. It's simple. Right? Let me just quickly run through. There's a third way in which you can describe things by the reference to qualities and categories, which Professor Yunus began our semester with a philosophical background, if you remember. And again, these are qualities that, you know, just to not keep you in suspense, yes, they don't apply to God, obviously. So the first three methods don't apply to God. The first three attempts at description don't apply to God. So what is it really we are talking about when we're talking about describing or defining God, right? Well, the fourth method says you can speak of relations, right? You can speak of you know, relations of space, relations of times, which are also part of the categories, by the way, right? And again, you can speak of kind of relations of, you know, well, God is our creator, or but again, for Maimonides, this doesn't work, right? Because it's a dependence. To define X in relation to Y, there's a dependence between X and Y. All right? Our being in Westhall depends on Westhalls pre-existing us. Right? We cannot come in here and say we are now in Westhall had Westhall not been here before us. So if you want to make reference in describing the divine to anything outside of the divine, then there's a dependence on something that must have pre-existed the divine, which really doesn't work. And this is why he also says you can't also speak about existence and will in that same sense. You can't say, well, you know, we can relate, if you wish, relation in terms of, you know, how we exist, God exists, and, you know, his existence or his will. Absolutely not, says Maimonides. It is totally, there's no way to relate these because we exist in a way which is absolutely different than God exists. We exist dependent upon God, whereas God exists full stop. Right? His existence depends on no other existence, whereas our existence and Westhall's existence and all other existences depend on the existence of God. Right? And so even in trying to make relations in that sense, he says it doesn't work. Likewise, if you think of will or etc. The fifth and final manner, which perhaps is the one way we can go, is in not really describing the thing, but in talking about it through talking about its action. So in this case, I don't know Maimonides, but I know that Maimonides is the one who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed, right? And so we're talking about action. And that's fine, but of course that's not talking about the thing in itself. That's not talking about God. If I say, well, God, you know, is the one who created the world, or you know, the world, its creation kind of references God, sure, but that's not really talking about God. That's not describing nor defining God. In brief, and I think I don't like time. Sorry. Right? So very much in brief, none of these ways work. And the key issue that he wants to get to is this. And this is coming back to the centrality of the synthesis. Right? He says it is necessary to demonstrate that by proof, i.e. to use Ibn Rushd language, that would mean demonstrative reasoning. It is necessary to demonstrate by proof that nothing can be predicated of God that implies any of the following four things. That implies either corporeality, emotion, change, or non-existence. In this respect, our knowledge of God is aided by the study of natural science. Our knowledge of God is aided by the study of natural science. John Scott Regina had said Christ wears two shoes in the world. Right? Earlier. So this notion of the synthesis is central here. To know God, we must be supported by natural philosophy and natural science. For the one who is ignorant of the latter, i.e. natural science, cannot understand the defect implied in emotions, the difference between potentiality, reality, non-existence, etc. Okay? And therefore, he says, at the end, he cannot prove that God exists or that the four things mentioned above are inadmissible in reference to God. To do that, one needs philosophy. One needs particularly Aristotelian philosophy, more than anything else. Very quickly then, just a final recap and a final few words. So what was the conclusion of Ibn Rushd's discussion, if you remember, as regards the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion? We had presented this very brief outline of his argument. What is the attitude of the law, religious law, as regards philosophy? And what was his conclusion? The faster you get this in, the faster we finish. No, I do thank you very much for your input. 40, okay? Okay, without further ado, 44, here we go. Good, all right. So the law commands, indeed, the study of philosophy. Yes, 0% the law forbids the study of philosophy, that's good. So in between tolerates and allows, but it actually commands, so very good. Unfortunately, I always do this to Hassan Thomas Aquinas, not enough time to say much about him, but I certainly invite you to read it very closely. It is one of the greatest examples of the synthesis. In fact, he is, of the three authors, the scholastic author you'll be reading. Permit me to apologize, Ammo Thomas, and permit me with that just to go to a closing remark to counter what we started with from Laurencio Valla and Hippolyte Taine. Perhaps these are not senseless thinkers after all. Perhaps they are. I don't know. I leave it in your hands to decide. But I like to close with this few words from Richard Rubinstein in his great work called Aristotle's Children. And I'll just read it. He says, in reliving the Aristotelian revolution, we understand that we are not just the children of Copernicus and Galileo, Adam Smith, Thomas Jefferson, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, but Aristotle's children. The heirs of a medieval tradition that seems more intriguing and inspiring as the shortcomings of modernity become clearer. Of course, most of us would not return to the Middle Ages if we could. We're not invited to go back. Few people today would embrace the assumptions and the conclusions of the medieval scholastics. But the Aristotelians' quest for meaning is also ours, and we have much to learn from their vision of a science infused by ethics and a religion unafraid of reason. In this little-known but formative chapter of our history, we may detect hints of a more humane and integrated global future. 2003, 13 years ago, when badna, right? Science infused by ethics and religion unafraid of reason. Thank you for your attention.